Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today we're going to be talking about the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Now, I've referenced it before in this video, but today we're going to be taking a week-by-week look at the first 4 weeks-ish of this invasion. The long and short of what I'm saying here is that Vladimir Putin is not only doing a horrible thing that the Russian people are actually beginning to notice, and also a number of oligarchs at this point, but that it is also an ill-advised thing to do based on terrain, military strategy, and other factors. So before we see this video series out, it seems like we should finally talk about the way that things are going on the ground. And I think that it's good to get a grounded perspective on what the state of play was weeks before the invasion, but also to get an idea of what's been going on here since the beginning. Just to give you a full-scale idea of the intensity of the Russian fuck-up we're discussing here. Now, I'm largely going to be framing a lot of this in Ukraine's favor, and make no mistake, they are going up against a formidable enemy. And this will not be easy by any means for them. Ukraine, even now, remains the underdog in this situation a month in. However, at this moment, I also see plenty of good reasons to root for this particular underdog. And let me walk you through them. First, let's consider the Ukrainian military. Would they be able to stop a Russian invasion? Yes and no. Now, they have improved a lot since 2014 when the Donbass War started, but they're also being outnumbered here 5-1 overall. They have a similar deficit in equipment as well, or at least they did at the beginning of the conflict, though their equipment, which is flooded in from advanced militaries from around the world, is considerably newer and more capable. These deficits aren't actually as bad as they first sound, though, as Russia has a lot of military commitments already, and a sizable force needed to secure their borders alone. They also suffer issues in deployment which are somewhat mitigated by the 4-month buildup at the border. But an infrastructural issue that Russia faces in mobilization against Ukraine is that the only quick way across Russia for heavy equipment, at this time of year especially, is their somewhat limited rail system, which is a bit more concentrated around their capital. However, they do have troops stationed in the ready, both in Crimea to the south and Belarus to the north, so this invasion can happen from basically all sides at once with Russian Navy support in the west. But Ukraine's biggest disadvantage is having no real way to control their own skies, which will likely lead to a lot of bombing to support ground troops who very much do not have their work cut out for them. Their likely strategy seems to be to blitz the country quickly. There's a lot of talk about quickly taking the head of the government, perhaps like they had in Afghanistan in a number of 3 days. How they intend to make this advance in Ukraine remains to be seen, but a situation like the encirclement of Kyiv is looking unlikely within the first week, and much less likely that they can achieve a governmental takeover in this time. So with all of that being said, would Russia be able to steamroll Ukraine in a matter of days? I don't think so. In the case of an all-out invasion, I assume that they would make quick personal victories in some areas, but also get bogged down in others, and advancing only with significant losses. Despite being outnumbered, Ukrainians have a number of very useful pieces of military hardware on their hands, with almost every major country sending them more as time passes and Russia continues to build up troops at the border. What we see in front of us seems to be a rather hasty Plan B that most likely wasn't the original plan. For one, timing is off in regards to the weather, which is forcing early Russian invasion efforts to a crawl. The mobilization we saw to the borders now appears to be the easy part, as Russian convoys are already stuck in the mud and running out of gas. Russia's more realistic plan was to use the threat of invasion to strong-arm NATO on the fact that peace and stability are more important to NATO than Ukraine's sovereignty. This, however, turned out not to be the case, as the Western response was united and consistent, basically calling Putin on his bluff. At that point, Putin didn't have much choice since he's been posturing for 4 months already. Russia had to go ahead at this point, essentially just making sure, upon entry, to find a way to accuse Ukraine of suddenly wanting to invade the Donbass in service of some hasty false flag events that have followed and are bordering on ridiculous. I hate to say it, but the Alex Jones-styled conspiracy theorists and the US State Department were right on this one. According to Russia, they parked their troops on the border to end tensions with the local Russian population. That's when Ukraine suddenly decided to start provoking them Again, according to Russia, a country with the world's most nuclear weapons and the army 5 times their size. Totally plausible narrative that they would just provoke them out of nowhere. Ukrainians did not invade past the front lines of the Donbass for 8 years of conflict. But they wanted to now when Russia poses 150,000 troops across the border and are threatening a full-scale invasion under the pretext of protecting Russian speakers. Yeah, that really seems likely. Perhaps the reason why all these false flags were so half-baked is this is again a hasty plan B. And it would appear that Putin has basically trapped himself in this situation because if he stopped now, all he would have achieved is taking the separatist regions, officially, which they controlled anyways, but these are also economic black holes and destroyed assets and infrastructure with most of the populations gone, and for this they get sanctioned and turned into international pariahs. And Nord Stream 2 is now suspended indefinitely. Putin can't really backpedal at this point. And at this point, the only potential beneficial choice for break-even is to press on and try to achieve the strategic goals he has set out to the people in Ukraine. This includes the land bridge to Crimea, severing Ukraine from the Black Sea, and at a worst-case scenario, annexing the entire country. Ukraine is currently experiencing warm, wet weather, meaning that the ground couldn't freeze enough to allow quick passage for armored vehicles in the north and the east of the country, because during the thaw, the ground in these regions are practically quagmires. This negates the possibility of a blitzkrieg, meaning defenders can better prepare and potentially do more damage to the Russian army struggling in the mud. Also, as a rule of thumb, attackers tend to lose more troops and equipment than their defenders. And all the Western-provided military equipment is also a major problem for them. Ukraine now has all sorts of advanced hardware which can do serious damage to Russian hardware. So even though the Russian army is larger and more powerful, the unfavorable terrain, the defenders, and the Western weapons, Russian soldiers are risking heavy casualties, and the troops' morale is just not that high to begin with. This isn't Crimea. It won't be a short, libelous campaign followed by Russian celebrations. This will also be Russia's first large-scale army logistical undertaking since 1945 against a modern mechanized army. The worst-case scenario would be them taking severe losses due to unexpectedly high resistance, supply chain problems, sabotage, and so on. Thus, the high casualties leading to severe domestic instability back home, which then cascades into more logistical problems for the army, loss of morale, and increases losses even further. Wash, rinse, repeat until Russia suddenly collapses under the weight of the crises it has created. However, this is an optimistic take, and even that would take some time. What Russian forces seem to have wanted out of this invasion, based on documents found in destroyed columns, was to get the government shut down within 2 weeks and to achieve all of Putin's objectives. Yet, we're now 2 weeks in, and Russians aren't even close to achieving any objectives. For example, Russia severely miscalculated by planning for low resistance and hoping for a quick advance. The plan seems to have been the following: break out of Crimea to the south, Belarus to the north, Russia Donbass to the east, and use ships moving into the Black Sea to put pressure on Odessa. While doing so, paradrop troopers into strategic locations to meet up with invading troops and secure key infrastructure, while bombing what they think they couldn't take in an effort to cut out any potential reinforcements. From here, the plan was to coordinate and begin to encircle major targets like Kyiv, and set to take cities within the first 2 weeks after campaigns of air raids to soften them up and drive civilian resistance out of high-value targets, and voila! Ukraine is annexed before the West can recover from its confusion.
They even pre-wrote an article for this occasion, which people found on the RIA Novosti website, titled Russia's Offensive and the New World. It's Google translated to English. Russia is restoring its unity. The tragedy of 1991, this terrible catastrophe in our history, its unnatural dislocation, has been overcome. Yes, at a great cost. Yes, through the tragic events of a virtual civil war, because now brothers, separated by belonging to the Russian and Ukrainian armies, are still shooting at each other, but there will be no more Ukraine as anti-Russia. Russia is restoring its historical fullness, gathering the Russian world, the Russian people, together in its entirety of Great Russians, Belarusians, and the Little Russians. If we had abandoned this, if we had allowed the temporary division to take hold for centuries, that we would not only betray the memory of our ancestors, but also be cursed by our descendants for allowing the disintegration of the Russian land. Vladimir Putin has assumed, without a drop of exaggeration, a historic responsibility by deciding not to leave the solution of the Ukrainian question for future generations. After all, the need to solve it would always remain the main problem for Russia, for two key reasons, and the issue of national security, that is, the creation of anti-Russia from Ukraine as an outpost for the West to put pressure on us, is only the second most important among them. Now this problem is gone. Ukraine has returned to Russia. This does not mean that its statehood will be liquidated, but it will be reorganized, re-established, and returned to its natural state as part of the Russian world. In what borders, in what form will the alliance with Russia be fixed, through the CSTO and the Eurasian Union or the Union State of Russia and Belarus? This will be decided after the end dispute in the history of Ukraine as anti-Russia. In any case, the period of the split of the Russian people is coming to an end. This is literal Nazi shit, by the way. Territorial conquest based on ethno-nationalism, aiming to restore the mythical past greatness of Russia. Oh, by the way, the Russian invasion is officially called Special Military Operation to denazify Ukraine. Go figure.
Putin's invasion began by unloading on Ukraine with ballistic missile launches at military bases, airports, and so on. This was done to cripple Ukrainian defenses as well as their chain of command, and send them into chaos so that Russians can just roll in and take them out easily. However, Ukrainians got information from NATO just in time and managed to shuffle things around right before the strikes. Most things didn't get destroyed, most equipment survived, and fortunately the chain of command remained intact. As for their paratroopers, their most elite special forces personnel, well, most were shot down while in the air, others were ambushed on the ground since Ukraine got good info on their targets. This was a major ace in the hole for Russia that was almost immediately wasted in a hasty invasion. So why are Russians moving in easy-to-ambush columns instead of simply rolling through the countryside? The answer is the mild weather turning the countryside into swamps, and getting stuck in the mud is only one of the reasons why they're having so much problems. The second reason is the lack of tire maintenance. Turns out, if you have vehicles, you need to move them around at least once a month, otherwise their tires start to decay and become brittle. And if you decrease pressure at that point, they will simply tear themselves apart. Due to narrow roads, no remaining connections to the Russian rail network, and a few strategically blown up bridges, the Russian advance has been consistently set to a crawl, and plagued with shortages of essential rations. And within days, there were cases of Russian soldiers looting grocery stores for food, and knocking on doors to ask for food and fuel. Since they're being forced to travel in single file and risk ruining their tires or simply getting stuck in the mud, a single vehicle running out of fuel can stop a 40-mile convoy. And a 40-mile convoy is bound to have multiple vehicles running out of fuel at any given moment. The issues of being logistically unprepared for a longer invasion are becoming more and more apparent as the struggle wages on, pushing past any expectations of resistance that the Russians had calculated. And though Russians do have a larger military overall, this poor deployment means a number of things. Convoys are easily trolled with javelin missiles or even Molotov cocktails, which tend to be more effective on soft targets like personnel carriers, but are likely to be less effective against trained military officers and/or armored targets. However, losing any vehicle in a convoy brings all the hassles of a vehicle running out of fuel and then some. This makes for a main strategy that's almost laughably easy for a few well-armed insurgents to stall for days, compounding their logistical issues and need for more rations and fuel than they had expected. But even when this isn't the case, due to the massive popularity of Ukraine's arming themselves in resistance, Russian forces who are showing up to battle are often massively overwhelmed and outnumbered, and find themselves facing fortified opponents the moment they try to advance on cities. And about all those abandoned tanks you've seen broken down all over Ukraine, for one reason or another. Each one represents about $16 million in Russian assets that, when abandoned, aren't particularly easy to steal, but aren't terribly hard to ruin with fire either, making them unusable if Russian soldiers return for them later. In the meantime, Russians have switched to indiscriminate bombing of civilians in an attempt to reclaim or take cities and certain infrastructure, which is a war crime, by the way, but also a sign of their frustration. And yet, rolling their tanks through the countryside was supposed to be the easy part, and now they've already turned this element into a massive fuck-up. Taking cities, but especially holding them when you face a highly motivated and armed insurgency, that is the hard part, and maintaining this state of affairs is the expensive part. For right now, fighting in the south seems to be the most dire, and could be a stepping stone to furthering the invasion towards Kyiv and capturing a large amount of land in the south. So for now, this is an area to keep an eye on. So far, these are the mighty Russia's lasting successes. Russia has taken control of the nuclear ruins of Chernobyl, and have fun with that, I guess. I'm pretty sure this is grade A land that no one wants to deal with, even if it does allow them an irradiated forward base in advancing towards Kyiv. In more dangerous news, Russian forces have overtaken Ukraine's nuclear power plant, which supplies the country with about 25% of its power. This is obviously a much more disadvantageous and dangerous situation. However, I don't think it's Russia's intention to necessarily weaponize this. For one, if they're trying to take over the area, it's good to have that intact, and I think it's far more likely that they're going to use this to shut off parts of the Ukrainian power grid in coordination with invasion attempts later on. And that's certainly something to watch out for with the power plant. But it's also worth noting that they've already set one of the buildings near it on fire in their invasion of it. And one wrong move here could be not only disastrous for Ukraine, but all of the surrounding countries, including Russia. And this kind of recklessness might go a long way in unifying many of those countries against Russia. Little has changed with a few key differences. At this point, Russia has dumped pretty much the entirety of their available invasion troops into Ukraine, and is now relying on Chechnyan reinforcements to bolster their ranks, although Chechnyans are also bolstering the Ukrainian ranks as well at the same time, so this is not necessarily effective as they're running to both sides. Russia can reinforce its deployed troops, but new troops would have to be transported and staged at the border beforehand, so this isn't an immediate solution to any of their continuing problems. Despite this, very little seems to have changed on the ground, with Russian forces and their convoys still largely stuck outside of Ukrainian cities. And these are also largely out of supplies, just to make matters worse. This has been a running problem throughout the engagement that's only gotten worse as time moves on. Russia has begun shelling targets in the west now, which has been previously left unscathed, as seen in the bombing of a military base near the Polish border. Some of the ground in the north has refrozen, meaning that for now the Russian advance is easier in some places since they don't have to combat the mud anymore. It seems that the Ukrainians' tactics involve not wasting their rockets and limited time in the air with drones on tanks. Instead, they focus them primarily on combat posts and supply columns. They don't really have any other choice. You'd need to fly hundreds of drones to hit every tank with an anti-armor rocket, and at that point, we haven't even considered the other vehicles yet. The Ukrainian tactics can therefore be summarized as not wanting to eliminate advancing Russian soldiers, because eliminating them entirely would be difficult if not impossible to begin with. They do want to isolate the areas where Russian forces have advanced to, cutting them off from supplies and their command structure. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian infantry takes out 6 to 12 tanks per day in sporadic missions, but just enough that no tanker will feel safe. Much of the info these attacks rely on is coming from NATO and US intelligence services. In isolation without supplies, Russian soldiers face the frozen landscape of northern Ukraine with little in the way of comfort or aid, and since the cold snap, this evidence has emerged of Russian soldiers who seem to have died of exposure to the elements. Ukraine is still calling for a no-fly zone to put an end to the increasingly savage bombing runs carried out by the Russians, one recently hitting a maternity center. However, many within the country are making it clear that despite what is now an unprecedented Russian deployment in the modern era, the Ukrainian people now need weapons, but not bodies, to fight this conflict. Despite there being no draft, voluntary efforts to defend Ukraine have been a tremendous success, and at this point Ukraine still has numerous troops in its reserves whom it hasn't felt the need to call into battle, instead trying to focus on maintaining what normality they can for the citizens that haven't fled the country. While outnumbering Ukraine 10 to 1 in the air, Russia has yet to dominate the skies over Ukraine, and Ukraine still has most of its planes in reserve, and seems to be using UAVs for aerial attacks on supply lines. Air defenses also remain intact, and with an intel advantage, air defenses can be placed strategically to intercept an incoming bombing run, while at the same time moving the equipment that the bombing run is meant to target. There are suggestions that Russian aerial equipment, much like what we're seeing on the ground, was poorly maintained and may not even be fully operational by modern standards. Still, the overwhelming numbers continue to allow them to keep pushing forward despite major losses to Ukrainian air defenses. It's also worth noting that with the Russian Air Force, in addition to their outdated and poorly maintained equipment, they're also poorly trained themselves, with the average Russian pilot having half the training in the air as even a UN pilot. Which leads to a second problem. Without in-depth training, there is little or no hope of Russian pilots being able to make large coordinated attacks, which is what they would need to overwhelm and eliminate Ukrainian air defenses and gain air superiority, signaling that since it hasn't happened yet, and was one of their day one goals, it might not happen at all. Even still, Russian aircraft claim the lives of civilians on the ground every day. It's also worth mentioning that with the amount of Russian equipment that's been abandoned or reclaimed in Ukraine, that might actually make the Russian military the biggest donor of arms to Ukraine in the world right now by some estimations, which is especially wild considering how the US recently upped their funding to Ukraine to over $10 billion. And actually in the weeks since this, we're sending a lot of air defenses now, but they're really getting everything they could possibly want from everywhere. Previous calls for weapons, not bodies, these were heard by the world, or at least those in the world who sell those type of weapons. So it's probably no longer true, if it ever was, that the Russian military could be thought of as the largest donor to Ukraine in this. Although maybe that was true for a brief window of time. The battle is still raging in the south, and victory here could be critically important for either side in the long run. But in the north, a battle to gain footing around Kyiv remains a losing one for Russian soldiers. However, the plan seems to be to continue the northern and southern advances until they meet in the middle of Ukraine around Kyiv. And it's worth noting that Russia is well supplied in the south because of control of Crimea. Though there is always the chance that the Russians can gain the upper hand in this by acting more and more brutally toward Ukrainian citizens, right now they seem to be on a track no longer for a Pyrrhic victory, but a humiliating defeat. Additionally, each attack against civilians will only serve to further radicalize the Ukrainian population, meaning that even in the case of capturing Ukraine, its citizens will only be more willing to commit acts of insurgency against those who would remain to control Ukraine in the event of foreign occupation by Russia, while at the same time galvanizing the world against them, which will likely continue to alienate them from their few allies in the world, such as China, Saudi Arabia, and Belarus. Given the current situation, it would seem that once this offense peters out, and its result will be the occupation of swampy fields, then Russians will be left with the chance to pull out or to commit some insanity. There is 2 to 3 days of frost left at the time I wrote this, and the mild weather will return afterwards. The situation is critical for both sides at this moment because ammo and supplies are running out on the Ukrainian side as well, even if they do happen to have better logistics and are easily supplied through the west, like the west of Ukraine, but also the number of countries in the west that are shipping things in through the west of Ukraine. It's also worth pointing out that they don't need hundreds of tons of gasoline to fortify their cities against Russian invasion, whereas invading Russian troops need a lot of fuel to pull this off. This will be my final report unless something else really important happens. We're pretty close to the 1-month anniversary of this conflict, and pretty much everything that I've told you in this episode so far has held. Major advances weren't made in the south, major advances weren't made around Kyiv, things seem to be stalled in pretty much all directions. The only way that Russians seem to really be advancing this war is through escalating civilian casualties. They don't really seem to have a strategy beyond that. There's a report on the ground that Russian military forces have taken 400 hostages and are holding them inside of a hospital that they have taken, and using them essentially as human shields for the moment, which you'll remember is exactly the propaganda that they said that the Ukrainian militants were using, which just further kind of proves this predictive power of whatever Russia says their opponents are doing is going to be the thing that they are considering doing in a few days. But outside of that, the issues that I had anticipated with a sudden frost causing the potential for a sudden Russian advance seems to have amounted to exactly nothing. The battles that we have been watching in the south, while bloody, haven't really amounted to much for Russia. While Ukraine continues to call for a no-fly zone to be implemented, they're actually doing quite well in the skies. Though this is despite the amount of civilian casualties that are being caused by bombing runs. And a lot of this is more like artillery, like shelling. It's not necessarily entirely aerial bombing runs. Ukraine is actually ruling the skies with their drones, which are being shipped in from all sorts of places, it seems like there are going to be new kamikaze drones being shipped in from America, along with an absolutely insane list of military hardware coming from the collective West. And this emphasizes a point that I haven't really talked about in relation to the geological dynamics of this situation, and that is that there's a border with Poland to the west of Ukraine, and the entire western side of Ukraine, with the exception of a few and recent escalated shellings and aerial attacks, are pretty safe. So compared to the way that eastern Ukraine is being hit right now, western Ukraine is being hit by absolutely nothing in comparison. Like, not even a scratch compared to what's happening in a place like Mariupol. But the fact that it is still open and still serves as a logistical pathway that allows all sorts of foreign aid to be backdoored into Ukraine. While Russia is attempting to limit the spread of that, trying to utilize their navy in the Black Sea, they have not successfully really encircled anything. And reports are that now they have even failed to take the suburbs of Kyiv. They're still a way out in the country even now, which is approximately where they were a couple weeks ago. This is not to say that there isn't a sort of horizontal progress that's been made. It's not to say that Russians haven't advanced the front lines in other places or begun to kind of spread out, essentially. But they're facing lower and lower reinforcement as the week goes on, and as they spread out, they're also seeing that the Ukrainians are seeing this as an opportunity to pounce. And we're seeing, with all these state-of-the-art tactical weapon systems that we're seeing flood into Ukraine, they're really capitalizing on this opportunity to decisively strike back. And this hints at something that has been in some ways kind of absent, and that's a uniform military-like official military response. Because we're seeing a lot of conscripts and a lot of little skirmishes. But right now, and mostly, just people defending their cities, but we haven't really seen a lot more than kind of skirmishes and javelin runs and a bunch of drone attacks. So basically high-tech rocket launchers and tiny little planes. This is really kind of the biggest military hardware that they've pulled out so far, and they have a lot in reserve, much like Russia. So the trend is starting now on the ground that Ukraine is starting to use this military hardware that they've been holding back through this conflict as they are closed in, so that they don't have to overextend themselves and project themselves out onto the countryside the way Russian forces have to. They can keep their military power tight within their cities, and it's really quite impressive that despite all the shelling due to the intel that Ukraine is getting from NATO countries, they've been pretty effective in being able to move the big military hardware around without having to bring it into play. So while a lot of people are pushing this idea that Russia is a big country that could stage up more military, as I discussed before, these reinforcements likely aren't coming soon, and right now Ukraine is poised to make a huge comeback, at least potentially. And they've been kind of waiting for the Russian forces to fall into this trap, where there's no resources coming in and they're stranded. They're stuck well away from their supply lines in the mud, and because all of a sudden they have come into range of the city's defenses, and I hope this goes well, because they have all the potential in the world to really decisively turn this around in this moment, even with what they have had to put up with on the ground. I also think it's important to note that because most of the combatants that we're seeing here are the pre-staged troops that were put on the border prior to the invasion starting, that really our sanctions haven't had really any ability to affect the Russian military yet, even while their effects on the Russian economy have been, pretty devastating in some ways. Just because Russia failed in their objectives so quickly, and I think this is definitely an optimistic view, and I wouldn't be a responsible content creator if I said that this was the likely scenario, but I think that we're seeing the silver lining. I think that we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I don't think that necessarily Ukraine needs a decisive utter defeat of Russian forces to win this. I think they just have to do well enough to really scare Russia, and then the negotiations will get a lot more interesting, as Ukraine will have a lot more power on its side, and can say, if you want any of these troops to make it out of my country alive, you drop most of your demands right now. If not even negotiating towards getting Crimea back. He could have that kind of power, and I think another important part to put in here is an agreement or kind of a pact between these countries that could enable him by saying that, we will drop at least a certain amount, if not all of our sanctions against Russia, the moment that they are willing to come to the peace table, which effectively puts a really big trump card on Zelensky's side in these discussions. Because right now there isn't really any assurance that even if a negotiation was met tomorrow, that necessarily the sanctions against Russia would end. And I think that a lot of these are likely to be long-term kind of punitive sanctions. And I think that, some businesses might actually decide, you know what, we're going to avoid supporting Russian companies in the future. I think there is kind of a sea change that is happening that won't go away even if this is fully resolved that way. But if you could lessen a lot of the sanctions, allow companies to still boycott Russia if they want, but take the official reasoning behind them currently not doing business with Russia away. Again, I think that could be a huge bargaining chip for Zelensky in this. And at the end of the first month, we are finally getting very close, it feels like, to some sort of diplomatic resolution. The demands on the Russian side have been decreasing, and Ukrainians seem more and more confident that they're going to be able to potentially scale things back enough that they can have an agreeable outcome, maybe even just with the assurance that Ukraine won't enter UN or NATO, while at the same time not stopping them from joining other unions. Though whether or not they will get back the areas of the Donbass or Crimea that have been declared independent through this and through the last decade of warfare, that remains to be seen. I think they'd really have to kick Russia's ass to do that. I think Putin would probably pull out and say that he had claimed one of his objectives before facing the kind of defeat that would lead to. But I think that Ukraine does potentially have the ability to really kick their asses militarily in a way that could win them some of their freedoms back in this negotiation. It's also worth saying that all of this sounds very positive. It's still an uphill fight. Russia could still do things to change this, maybe overnight, maybe within a few weeks. Like, they could make the long-term war really bad, and they could keep escalating civilian casualties to the point where any good leader would say, I don't want more and more of my people to die, even if I have to concede politically on a few points. Tensions are running high on both sides, so this is going to be a really interesting negotiation. I think that, diplomatically speaking, looking for a diplomatic solution to this, countries should try to give Zelensky as much power by saying, we will go along with X that you agree to, and basically kind of, I don't know, I think we should be at the negotiating table too, in a way, kind of balancing the scales a little bit and giving Zelensky more power to ask for reduced Russian demands. But I'm not really sure that we're doing this. And for the most part, other than for the moment it seems The Intercept, no one is really asking this question. Everyone else is asking when we'll start the no-fly zone and how quickly we can get into World War III. Another thing that I will say that the media has also been kind of overhyping is the Russian protests. While the protesters are incredibly brave, as it looks like they're facing a potential of 15 years in prison for just saying no to war publicly, they are big, but they aren't as big as some even recent Russian protests have been. And it seems like, and polling is difficult, right? Don't get me wrong, polling is difficult. But it seems like most Russians, from what we can tell, support the war. Now, does that mean they support what's actually happening on the ground? No. They support what they think their government is doing. Much like in the same way that we've been polling Americans for about a month now, and we have consistently been saying that we were in support of starting a no-fly zone. However, anytime that you ask that question by saying, would you support a no-fly zone if it meant escalation of war, or, kind of direct military engagement, people say no. And that's exactly what a no-fly zone is, unless both sides are bluffing. But I think there's a high likelihood of someone calling that bluff on one side or another. And in this case, Americans almost like 2-1 disagree with joining the war. Whereas if you just ask them about no-fly zone, it's kind of 2-1 in favor of it. There is also kind of a fear within Russia based on these laws and a suspicion, what if I say that I'm against the war in this poll, And it's just the Russian intelligence trying to figure out who doesn't support this. What if someone shows up at my door? And kind of on that note, the way that we are pushing, let's say, like Russian athletes, Russian celebrities, anyone who interfaces outside of Russia with the public, we're kind of forcing them to denounce the war. That's well-intentioned, but as Russian citizens, that puts them in a really dangerous place. And I think we should be a little bit more sympathetic to that before we necessarily cancel individual Russians that aren't a part of the war because they won't speak out on it. I think that, to a certain degree, some of that support for war may come from fear. But at the same time, it would be totally ignorant to pretend as though there is not a nationalist sentiment within Russia, within the Russian public, that supports the idea of anything that would give Russia more geopolitical power or kind of raise their geopolitical power back to what it was in the Soviet era without necessarily embracing all the other aspects of the Soviet era. And I think that there are a lot of Russians who see this, who would even probably wholeheartedly support an actual on-the-ground invasion and annexation of Ukraine to this end. But it's really hard to say how high any of these segments of the Russian population are, because we're about 3 iron curtains of propaganda away from direct contact with the needs and wants and desires of the Russian populace. But I just do want to point out that despite there being massive protests, this does not necessarily mean that the majority of Russians are against the war, that we should expect some sort of a Russian revolution in the streets. That's about it then. Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today we're going to be talking about the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Now, I've referenced it before in this video, but today we're going to be taking a week-by-week look at the first 4 weeks-ish of this invasion. The long and short of what I'm saying here is that Vladimir Putin is not only doing a horrible thing that the Russian people are actually beginning to notice, and also a number of oligarchs at this point, but that it is also an ill-advised thing to do based on terrain, military strategy, and other factors. One thing that hasn't been a feature of this war is the large-scale cyber attacks like Ukraine has faced for years that have shut down any number of utilities for a number of days in the past, one attack breaking an estimated of 10% of all computers in Ukraine. However, this is another area that global support, especially from the US, has caused Ukraine to become much more competent in. At this point, Ukraine even exports its cybersecurity capabilities, which would tell us why Russian forces are finding it necessary to capture the Ukrainian nuclear plant and other pieces of key infrastructure instead of just taking it down remotely using cyber warfare. The Foxblade malware deployed on day 1 seems to have utterly failed, while at the same time, Ukrainians have succeeded in hacking Russia's Netflix alternative to briefly show on-the-ground fighting in Ukraine to counter Russia propaganda efforts, along with several other small-scale attacks on Russian digital infrastructure. It's a little bit closer to 4 weeks in, by the way, as I'm recording this, and within the last week, we have actually seen Russia hacking a few Ukrainian television networks in order to show really hastily deep-faked footage of fake Zelensky surrendering to Russia and advising Ukrainian citizens to surrender themselves. And it seems like it's just so sloppy that most people won't believe it. But maybe maybe it wasn't meant for all people. Maybe it was meant to just knock away a few percentage points of the resistance. You know what I mean? And maybe it will be effective in that. We saw how damaging this strategy had been for many years in a row as Russia targeted Ukrainian power infrastructure in the dead of winter. But it seems that after the 2017 NotPetya ransomware attack spilled out of Ukrainian borders and caused a total of $10 billion in damage to the world economy, that the world's tech experts decided that Ukraine needed real help in the cyber warfare they were facing. This attack also brought condemnation from abroad as the war splashed over its borders, and in the end, even affected Russian businesses. Trump's press secretary, Sarah Sanders, announced that this was, quote, a part of the Kremlin's ongoing effort to destabilize Ukraine, and this demonstrates more clearly than ever Russia's involvement in the ongoing conflict, here referencing the ongoing invasion in the Donbass. She added that this was also a reckless and indiscriminate cyber attack that will be met with international consequences. The UK's Lord Maud was even more direct on this matter. The UK government judges that the Russian government, specifically the Russian military, was responsible for the destructive NotPetya cyber attack of June 2017. The Kremlin has poised Russia in direct opposition to the West. Yet, it doesn't have to be this way. We call upon Russia to be the responsible member of the international community it claims to be, rather than secretly trying to undermine it. We are committed to strengthening coordinated international efforts to uphold a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace. After 5 years of focus on cyber defense later, and Russia's attacks seem to be considerably less dangerous, the most effective cyber weapon of the moment being humble DDoS attacks. Dr. Lennart Maschmeyer of the Center for Security Studies at the Swiss University ETH Zurich says Russia's cyber strategy so far seems more improvised. A plausible scenario for devastating cyber attacks was that Russia had planned this invasion for a long time, and pre-positioned implants across Ukraine's critical infrastructure in order to cause mass disruptions, coinciding with the military invasion. That does not seem to be the case, though. The cyber operations that we have seen do not show long preparation, and instead look rather haphazard. This once again reminds us of the real likelihood that this was a rushed invasion because a scared Putin got spooked and went in at exactly the wrong time. But what is important to keep in mind with state cyber warfare is that even if a new type of attack or new type of malware is successfully deflected or nullified by Ukrainian cyber defenses, that new method of attack, that new way of exploiting a system now exists out there somewhere. And people will find it, and within years we will probably be seeing the exact type of or modified types of the type of cyber warfare platforms that both the US, Ukraine, and Russia are using right now, more commonly sold among hackers on the black market, and therefore making everyone less safe from a cybersecurity perspective. And this is really the problem with state-level cyber warfare in general, in that much like the creation of the nuclear bomb, every time we create a new massively powerful cyber warfare technique that can bypass even a country with advanced cyber defenses, then your average computer user, or even most American companies who might have your data, get lost in that arms race very quickly, and it creates openings where our data is vulnerable. Even if our personal security practices are good, the companies that we allow to have our data, their practices might not be as good. So even though this seems to be the little cyber war that didn't, it will have drastic cybersecurity ramifications in the long term that will ripple out. Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today we're going to be talking about the situation on the ground in Ukraine. Now, I've referenced it before in this video, but today we're going to be taking a week-by-week look at the first 4 weeks-ish of this invasion. The long and short of what I'm saying here is that Vladimir Putin is not only doing a horrible thing that the Russian people are actually beginning to notice, and also a number of oligarchs at this point, but that it is also an ill-advised thing to do based on terrain, military strategy, and other factors. I think that a lot of the Ukrainian efforts by way of propaganda or journalism, or even this idea that, like, when they capture Russian soldiers, they've been making their mommies come from Russia to pick them up. And I think that's awesome. That's incredible. It's like, you're never going to get any more shit. Like, can you imagine how embarrassing that would be just for one? You know, like, your mother is going to give you so much shit if she has to come pick you up from the front lines. And also imagine all of those angry Russian women trying to navigate these convoys and just all of the bullshit coming into Russia to pick up their children. That's just going to bog this down so much more. Like, I don't think many people are actually going to do it. I think it's more of a propaganda stunt, but it's just hilarious to think about, right? And it's certainly good news that what appears to be a large gulf between the two countries in terms of strategy and logistics is helping Ukrainians on the ground. It's still not entirely good news at the moment. A little over 2 weeks into the invasion, we were already seeing that Russian forces are largely stalled, but continuing to push forward. They haven't made any real large successes on the ground, and they've even been pushed out of at least one city that they'd held. However, they continue to shore up their troops, and more Russian soldiers are entering the country every day, as well as their military equipment pouring in from rail lines just over the border. And so the Russian advance seemed to be summed up best as 1 step forward and 2 steps back. But eventually, over time, they will be able to overcome some of their logistical hurdles through better planning and preparations for the actual situation that they're facing on the ground. The military convoy will eventually advance, and it will eventually reach its destination, and perhaps to make up for their numerous failures on the ground and the way that Putin is being made a fool of, has stepped up Putin's intents to bomb parts of Ukraine to the ground.
I believe the Russians had a shock and awe campaign planned, that they would rush in, get down to Kiev quickly, depose Zelensky, put in their own puppet regime, and then let the Ukrainians accept that as a fait accompli and move on. What they found out is quite the opposite. The problem with the Russians is not their equipment, it's their tactics. Even though they came from a huge training operation in Belarus, I didn't see them maneuvering the way a well-trained army would.
And this sees him committing many war crimes. And it's not that there weren't war crimes here to begin with. As you can see on repurposed signs throughout Ukraine, all paths in Ukraine lead to the Hague for Russian forces.
The Russian strategy, unfortunately, is working well as they shell the cities. You can see the massive destruction being taken inside the cities, the bombing of the protected sites, shooting the maternity ward, using rockets and artillery well before they use a whole lot of troops, classic Russian tactics.
Tonight, the humanitarian crisis only getting worse. The United Nations saying a staggering 10 million Ukrainians have either fled the country or have been displaced internally, half said to be children.
After 2 weeks of logistical invasion failures, remember that as people often invoke this parallel to Afghanistan, like when Russia invaded Afghanistan, they killed the target of the country in 3 days. And judging by how quickly they ran through their supplies in this invasion, it seems that despite the weather, Putin had expected to do something very similar here. As I said in my previous video, he expected to have Kyiv and the major cities around Ukraine encircled by his forces within 2 weeks. And that still hasn't happened 4 weeks in at this point. Although, he is inching closer to accomplishing this every day. One of the big stories happening about 2 weeks ago was Mariupol, where Russia has agreed to create civilian evacuation quarters in order to reduce civilian casualties. However, as an Al Jazeera journalist who got behind the lines of Mariupol soon discovered and showed the world, Russia seemed to be specifically bombing these civilian corridors in what had agreed to be a ceasefire, which mirrors their tactics since the Minsk agreement in their first invasion of Ukraine, where the firing never really stopped for very long.
The largest and deadliest strike yet on the capital. Kyiv has been rocked by massive explosions, images emerging today of the size of the blast. Video verified by ABC News shows the moment the missile hit a shopping mall on the edge of Kyiv, killing at least 8 people. As dawn broke, the sheer scale of the aftermath was revealed. Rescuers searching for survivors, pulling victims from the rubble. Residents nearby were left bewildered, searching for belongings in bombed-out buildings. The Russian military releasing this astonishing video they say is of the attack, And tonight, rescuers searching for survivors in the rubble of an art school in the besieged city of Mariupol after Russian forces attacked. Hundreds believed to be trapped. Ukrainians in the key port city defiantly rejecting Russian demands to surrender. The death toll soaring. Residents forced to bury the dead in the shadows of destroyed buildings. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry now accusing the Russians of forcibly deporting thousands of city residents, including children, to parts of Russia. The US says it's investigating. In Kherson, the shocking images of Russians firing on a crowd of protesters. Verified video circulating online shows the moment Russian forces opened fire on the crowd, firing stun grenades to try to break up the peaceful protest. At least 4 reportedly injured, 1 with a bullet wound.
Except that this seems to be intentionally employed not only to target civilians, but also to concentrate them into specific locations to be targeted and picked off by Russian artillery. Increasingly, we're seeing Russia's efforts to bomb cities to the ground. In order to flatten the resistance there, we see increasing Russian efforts to cut off civilian populations from water, food, and power, as well as various other necessities. And maybe it's just because the world is only paying attention now to this in a way that we perhaps haven't paid attention to the tactics of similar crises that invoked a number of war crimes themselves. But what is being done here against these people is so utterly foul, and it's such a cowardly technique for a stronger opponent to militarily take. And I think that shows a certain weakness that might be present within Russia at the moment, or at least I can hope. It feels like Russia is Russian this, and has been from the very beginning. It also seems like China isn't as willing to back Putin economically as he'd hope, and as we see economic and military plans simultaneously failing, Putin is facing massive and continuous protest, tanking poll numbers, and more Russian people beginning to decry the war in spite of serious crackdowns on anti-war media and protest, which could lead now to up to 15 years behind bars. Could it be that Putin fears he is losing his grip, his control over the country? We can see this beginning to fail within his own oligarchy, many of which are starting to speak out against him in some way. We see Russian solidarity failing in Belarus. We're also seeing what seems to be an unprecedented amount of solidarity, at least between the people of the former Soviet states, as civilians from these countries continue to pour in to supplement Ukraine's self-defense forces, mainly through the Polish border. None of this is an outcome that anyone necessarily would have expected, although in some ways it is an outcome that I had hoped would come to pass. And let's hope that even while these war crimes persist and increase in frequency, let's hope that this is the moment where Putin's back is to the wall. As a part of this discussion, it's worth reiterating a point that I made earlier. Russian propaganda is often repurposed from America's talking points in propaganda. To this end, as they're writing this, they're simultaneously shutting people out of the public internet and at the same time rebroadcasting Tucker Carlson with Russian subtitles. And that is not actually even a metaphor. As I previously mentioned, Russian excuses for civilian casualties are basically exactly what the US state had said regarding our own warfare in Iraq, and a recent strain of Russian propaganda about biological weapons, funded by the US, existing in Ukraine, seems to take its lead from the lab leak theory, although this time seemingly with little basis in reality. However, this is a troubling sign because it follows in a previous Russian strategy that aided propaganda efforts that led up to the invasion. And this is Russia pushing a fake narrative and then using false flag operations to support their propaganda, as I noted in a previous episode. Given other escalations and war crime committed, could this indicate a coming Russian biological attack? And in face of such a thing, who will continue to remain neutral? Let's hope that the atrocities that we have seen already are the tactical last gasp of the Russian Empire, or at least this iteration of it. And let's hope that if things do fall apart here as they have in the past, let's hope that this iteration of the crisis, someone lends Russia an olive branch. This is a country that could potentially be a powerful ally, and has been a powerful enemy. And I think we're moving into a world that is increasingly globalized and interconnected, where there isn't as much of a place for countries to have enemies anymore. And I think that hopefully this is a sign that will usher in a new geopolitical age of peace, cooperation, and expansion of allyship, and solidarity through nations, both locally and globally, instead of the corporate globalization that we saw in the 1990s. Let us instead cooperate, not to ship things all over the world to exploit labor as effectively as possible, but instead use our cooperation to build each other's countries up, and our populations up, reducing inequality and poverty, but building the world into something greater than it currently is. And one step towards really finding ourselves in that world after the dust clears, we actually need to hold accountable those who push for war crimes, those who ordered them to be done, to send a message to the rest of the world that this is an age of government-sponsored terrorism is finally coming to an end, and it will no longer be tolerated. Only then can we move forward to a politics of peace. However, it's important to note that none of this is much solace to Ukrainian civilians now. Of the two major bodies that prosecute war crimes in some way, you have the UN Security Council, on which Russia has a veto vote, and the ICC, which neither Russia or Ukraine is a party to. Ukraine did, however, give the ICC permission to investigate war crimes within its borders during the first Russian invasion, and nothing has come of this so far. And this is partially because to enforce such rulings would require military force, but more importantly, the political will to fight Russia directly, which none of the world's governments seems to possess, Ukraine excluded. That said, should there be regime change in Russia, it might be the case that Putin and his compatriots in this right might be held accountable at a later date. However, this has little bearing on what is happening now, and Putin has been clear in his actions. War crimes just aren't going to stop him.
They certainly are not moving anywhere as quickly as they had planned. The reason, twofold. Number one, they've been sloppy, they've been ill-disciplined, they've lost their supplies, they've run out of food. And then the second reason, of course, is the stiff, tough resistance that has been shown by the Ukrainian forces, all the way from the professional military down to the territorial forces.
Будемо займатися зачисткою одного із сіл, в якому зараз знаходяться орки з броньованою технікою. По даним розвідки, до батальйону.
They were moving properly the way that you move to an ambush site. They seem to be well disciplined. They seem to be in the correct formations as they move forward. They obviously got hit by probably a guard unit that was protecting the tanks, and that's where you could hear the fire coming in from the Russian side. They were talking to their higher headquarters on either their cell phones or their radios. The higher headquarters probably told them to withdraw. Withdrawing under fire is a very difficult task, but they seem to do it quite well. This unit was obviously well trained. They did it exactly by the book.
Now that I've given you all of the concepts, now that you can fully understand the situation, I finally wanted to show you a bit of the take that I actually wanted to make. Ukraine has been a country for less than 100 years, and in the life cycle of a nation, is still taking their first steps into independence. Only in 1991, 31 years ago, taking the first steps into true independence. 31 years of fire in the Ukrainian soul over the last century. The history of Ukraine has been an aggressive fight against Russian soft power and civil servants given orders by the president to shoot on sight. They fought long and hard time and again for their independence, and every time that they've gotten it, they ask for more and more. They get a name, statehood, then they become an independent country that's still controlled by Russia's sphere of influence and soft power. It was once a nation held by oligarchy and corruption, and then decades following their independence, they fight back against even that. They fight back against the idea of their future should be tied so closely to Russia, when Russia seems to have no interest in seeing them thriving and independent. And the last 8 years, militias have fought along the front lines in Ukraine. Civilian territories have suffered intermittent shelling and ceasefire pretty much since the nation began, but it is not stopping them. I look forward to the future with the brightest hope of what Ukraine might become in 10, 20, or even 30 years. I am already so proud of what they are. Proud of the zeal by which they defend the independence they have fought for the last 31 years. And I am inspired by the way that even the citizens of Ukraine will not let those 30 years be in vain now. And I have been blessed to be able to share with you this beautiful story. And the beautiful future that I dream of. It may not happen. But I think that if there is any hero that can summon the strength it takes to mount obstacles that first seem insurmountable, to defend itself against Russia and somehow come out of it stronger and more united with its surrounding countries and with its own citizens than it ever was before, I think perhaps Ukraine might be that nation. They hope, I hope, that years of invasion and fighting for independence doesn't sour them and their culture in the way that we saw in Afghanistan. Because I have seen a change in Ukraine even in my lifetime. If you want an inspiring story, I inspire you to watch either of my videos on Euromaidan. It was in writing and researching the first of those videos that I first felt that I could relate to them. You know, having a huge protest movement for the independence of my country, having just come out of Occupy years before, and we were never shot out in the streets. I mean, for the most part, Occupy wasn't even treated as brutally by the police as something like Black Lives Matter has been, as many modern protests have been. Like, I've watched protests get more brutal over my lifetime, and still, I can't imagine what Ukrainians face towards the end of Euromaidan, and if that was happening here, I can't imagine the bravery I would have to summon to stand up to those police who have told that it is perfectly acceptable to murder us. Even if you would say within Black Lives Matter that this is kind of implied in policing, especially if you happen to have a certain skin color that doesn't look quite like this, even today, I can see where you're coming from there. But it's not like your president was literally saying to the police, I don't care if you have to kill them, get them out of Maidan Square. I can't imagine that scenario, and again, the courage shown by Ukrainians who continue to fight for their rights in that moment, that is astounding. And it's the same type of courage that they will need to retain their independence and their goodwill on their part. I hope that Ukraine can forgive us for not setting up no-fly zones and not putting boots on the ground. I'm sure that we would all feel differently if this was our country and not one that maybe some of us are just now really hearing about. And a big part of the reason that we don't, our own self-interest, we don't want to jump in this fight because we might get hurt. No one wants to poke the nuclear bear. But again, I'm sure we would all feel differently if this was our country. So to Ukraine, I know that you have the spirit. I know that you have the courage. I know that it means enough to you that you will put your heart into defending your country, and I wish you the best. I hope that our countries can find more and more ways to support you. And I hope that we find more and more diplomatic ways to support you. I hope that this can end soon without you having to concede your territory. I'm hoping that these things that we're doing to apply pressure, that Ukraine needs to stay safe and come to a victory in this conflict. And I'd like to end this series with 3 important words. Glory to Ukraine.